Why do some women become stronger after losing everything? Because there's a moment. No one talks about the moment you realize the thing you thought would always be there is gone, and you're left staring at a future you no longer recognize. You pray, but the silence feels heavy. You try to stay strong, but deep down, you're wondering why God allowed something so important to fall apart. And the hardest part isn't always what you lost. The fear that what was lost took part of you with it. But what if this season isn't revealing that God abandoned you? What if it's revealing something you were never meant to build your life on in the first place? You may not have expected life to look like this. There was a time when you believed certain prayers would be answered differently, certain relationships would last, certain dreams would survive, certain plans would unfold exactly as you imagined. You trusted, you hoped, you waited, yet somewhere along the way, something slipped through your hands. Maybe it was a marriage that ended when you thought it would heal. Maybe it was a relationship you believed God had ordained. Maybe it was a career that once gave you direction. Maybe it was a season of stability that suddenly disappeared. Or perhaps it was something harder to explain, a version of your future that no longer exists. The difficult part is not always the loss itself. Sometimes the hardest part is waking up each morning and realizing you are still carrying it. People see your strength. They see you functioning. They see you showing up. They see you smiling when necessary and handling responsibilities the best you can. But what they do not always see is the conversation happening inside your mind. The questions, the doubts, the exhaustion. The moments when you wonder why God allowed something so important to fall apart. You pray, but some prayers feel heavier than they used to. You read scripture, but sometimes the words seem distant. You try to trust, but fear keeps interrupting. Part of you wants to believe God is still working. Another part wonders if He has forgotten about you, and that internal conflict can become overwhelming because you know what faith is supposed to sound like. You know the verses, you know the promises. You know the encouragement Christians often give during difficult seasons. But when loss becomes personal, everything feels different. What sounds simple in theory can become incredibly difficult in practice. Trust God. Wait on God. Believe God. Those words are beautiful until you find yourself standing in the middle of a situation that refuses to change. Then waiting becomes painful. Then trusting becomes costly. Then believing becomes a battle. You begin to discover that faith is not tested when everything is working. Faith is tested when nothing makes sense. And perhaps that is where you are today. You are trying to understand why life feels so different from what you expected. You are trying to understand why God seemed to allow something precious to disappear. You are trying to understand why a season that looked so promising became a season of heartbreak. And if you are honest, there may be moments when you feel disappointed not only with life, but with God Himself. Not because you want to, not because you have abandoned your faith, but because pain has a way of creating questions that comfort never creates. Questions like, why did this happen? Why didn't God stop it? Why did He allow me to become so attached to something that would eventually leave? Why did He remain silent when I needed answers? Why does it seem like other people are moving forward while I am still trying to recover? These questions often live in places that many believers are afraid to talk about. Yet throughout Scripture, God never seemed intimidated by honest questions. Again and again, we see people bringing their confusion, grief, disappointment, and fear before Him. Not because they lacked faith, but because they were human. One of the greatest misunderstandings about spiritual maturity is the idea that strong believers never struggle. The truth is often the opposite. The strongest believers are usually those who have wrestled deeply with God and chosen to trust Him anyway. But that trust is rarely formed in comfortable seasons. It is often formed in painful ones. And that reality can be difficult to accept. Because loss changes things. It changes how you see yourself. It changes how you see your future. Sometimes it even changes how you see God. You may find yourself becoming more cautious, more guarded, less willing to hope, less willing to expect good things. Not because you become negative, but because disappointment has taught you how painful hope can feel when circumstances collapse. So you protect yourself. You lower expectations. You stop dreaming as boldly as before. You stop believing as freely as before. You tell yourself it is safer that way. Yet, even then, something inside you continues searching. Something inside you still wants answers. Something inside you still wants to know that this loss was not meaningless. Because deep down, you do not simply want relief from pain. You want understanding. You want purpose. You want to know that your suffering is not random, that your tears have not been wasted, that the years you invested have not disappeared into nothingness, that God can still bring something good out of what feels broken. And this is where many women find themselves standing at a spiritual crossroads. One path leads toward bitterness. The other leads toward transformation. The problem is that both paths begin in the same place. Pain, loss, disappointment, confusion. At first, they look almost identical. Both women cry. Both women grieve. Both women struggle. Both women ask difficult questions. But eventually, something separates them. One allows pain to convince her that God is no longer trustworthy. The other slowly discovers God in ways she never would have discovered him otherwise. One becomes defined by what was lost. The other becomes transformed through what was lost. And that transformation does not happen overnight. It happens through a process, a painful process, a confusing process, a process that often feels unfair while you are living through it. Because when loss first arrives, it rarely feels productive. It feels destructive. It feels like something is being taken away. It feels like life is becoming smaller instead of larger. It feels like doors are closing instead of opening. It feels like prayers are failing instead of being answered. And perhaps that is why so many women miss what God is doing in difficult seasons. Because what he is building often looks like destruction before it looks like construction. What he is healing often feels like breaking before it feels like restoration. What he is strengthening often feels like weakness before it feels like power. The challenge is that you usually cannot see the full picture while you are standing inside it. You only see what has disappeared. You only see what hurts. You only see what is missing. But what if there is something happening beneath the surface that you have not recognized yet? What if this season is not only about what you lost? What if it is also about what God is revealing? What if the story is bigger than the disappointment? What if the greatest danger is not the loss itself? What if the greatest danger is believing the wrong thing about God because of the loss? Because that is where the deepest battle often begins. Not in your circumstances, not in your finances, not in your relationships, but in your mind. The real battle starts when pain begins whispering conclusions. God has abandoned you. Your future is over. Nothing good can come from this. You are forgotten. You are disqualified. You will never recover. And if those conclusions take root, they can wound the soul far more deeply than the original loss ever could. Which raises a question that changes everything. What if God has not stopped working at all? What if the loss that feels like the end of your story is actually exposing something that must be understood before the next chapter can begin? Because before God rebuilds, he often reveals. And what he reveals first may surprise you. When everything seems to be falling apart, most people focus on what they are losing. That is understandable. Loss demands attention. It captures your thoughts. It occupies your emotions. It follows you into quiet moments. It shows up unexpectedly when you hear a song, remember a conversation, revisit a dream, or imagine the future you once expected to have. Loss has a way of making itself impossible to ignore. But while you are focused on what is leaving your life, there is another question that often goes unnoticed. What was your heart depending on before the loss happened? This is not an easy question. In fact, it can be uncomfortable because most people do not intentionally place their security in things other than God. It happens gradually, quietly, almost invisibly. A relationship becomes a source of identity. A career becomes a source of worth. A plan becomes a source of peace. A dream becomes a source of hope. A person becomes a source of emotional stability. None of these things are necessarily bad. The problem begins when something God intended to be a blessing slowly becomes a foundation. Because blessings make terrible foundations. They were never designed to carry the weight of your soul. Only God can do that. Yet many of us do not realize how much we are leaning on something until it is removed. That is one of the painful truths about loss. It exposes dependencies that comfort keeps hidden. When life is going well, it is easy to assume your trust is fully in God. But when something important disappears, the reaction often reveals where your confidence was actually resting. This is why loss can feel so You are not only grieving what was taken, you are also discovering how much of your emotional security was connected to it. Perhaps you believed you would be okay because a certain relationship was always there. Perhaps you felt secure because a particular plan seemed guaranteed. Perhaps you imagined your future unfolding in a specific way. Then suddenly that foundation cracked. And when it cracked, everything connected to it began shaking as well. Your confidence, your expectations, your sense of direction, your understanding of who you are. That kind of shaking can be terrifying, especially when you spend years building your life around something that now no longer exists. The natural response is to try to recover what was lost, to rebuild the same structure, to recreate the same situation, to get back to what once felt safe. But sometimes God allows the shaking because He sees something you cannot yet see. He sees that the foundation beneath the structure is not strong enough. And before He builds something stronger, He exposes what cannot support the future He has prepared. This pattern appears throughout Scripture. God often works beneath the surface before He works above it. He addresses foundations before outcomes. He transforms hearts before circumstances. He develops character before assigning greater purpose. Yet most people want the opposite. We want God to change circumstances first. We want immediate solutions, immediate relief, immediate answers, immediate restoration. But God frequently begins much deeper because He is not merely interested in improving your situation. He is interested in transforming you. And transformation usually starts with revelation. The revelation of where trust has been misplaced. The revelation of where identity has become attached to temporary things. The revelation of where fear has gained influence. The revelation of where dependence on God has become weaker than dependence on circumstances. This is difficult because nobody enjoys discovering these things. Nobody enjoys realizing they were relying on something that could be taken away. Yet this discovery can become one of the greatest turning points in spiritual growth. Because once false foundations are exposed, real foundations can begin to form. Think about what happens when a storm strikes a house. The storm does not create weakness. It reveals weakness. The weakness was already there. The storm simply made it visible. In much the same way, loss often reveals what was hidden beneath the surface of everyday life. It reveals fears you did not know you carried. It reveals attachments you did not know existed. It reveals expectations you never realized were controlling your peace. And while that revelation hurts, it is also a gift, because God cannot heal what remains hidden. He cannot strengthen what you refuse to acknowledge. He cannot rebuild areas of trust that you do not realize have been damaged. This is one reason some women emerge stronger after devastating loss. Not because they enjoyed suffering, not because they wanted hardship, but because loss forced them to confront truths they may never have faced otherwise. It exposed the difference between trusting God and trusting what God had given them. And there is a significant difference. Many people trust God as long as He continues providing what they expect. But deeper faith develops when trust remains even after expectations collapse. That kind of faith is rare, and it is forged through experiences nobody would voluntarily choose. You begin to understand that God is good even when circumstances are not. You begin to understand that His character remains trustworthy even when life feels confusing. You begin to understand that His presence is not dependent on visible success. These lessons are not learned through comfort alone. They are often learned through loss. Yet there is another struggle that emerges during this process. Once old sources of security begin disappearing. Fear often rushes in to fill the empty space. Fear asks questions like, what happens now? What if nothing gets better? What if this loss permanently changes my future? What if I never recover what I lost? What if God does not come through? Those questions can become relentless. and the mind starts searching desperately for certainty. Unfortunately, certainty is usually the one thing God does not immediately provide. Instead, He often provides something deeper, dependence, because dependence teaches you to lean on Him rather than your own understanding. Dependence teaches you to trust His wisdom when you cannot see the outcome. Dependence teaches you to walk by faith instead of by visible evidence. That sounds inspiring when you hear it. It feels much harder when you live it, because dependence requires surrender, and surrender requires releasing control. For many women, that is one of the most difficult parts of loss. Not simply losing something important, but losing the illusion of control. You realize you cannot force healing. You cannot force restoration. You cannot force answers. You cannot force timing. You cannot force God's plans to unfold according to your schedule. And that realization can either create panic or create freedom. Panic if you believe everything depends on you. Freedom if you begin believing everything ultimately rests in God's hands. The transition between those two perspectives is where growth begins. Not instant growth, not easy growth, but real growth. The kind that changes how you see life. The kind that changes how you see yourself. The kind that changes how you see God. And perhaps that is what is happening right now, even if you cannot fully recognize it. Perhaps the loss is revealing more than it is removing. Perhaps God is exposing foundations that were never meant to carry your future. Perhaps He is teaching you to build your confidence somewhere deeper than circumstances. But this leads to another painful question. If God is rebuilding trust, why does He sometimes seem so silent while doing it? Why does it often feel like heaven is quiet during the moments we need answers most? Because for many women, the loss itself is difficult, but the silence that follows can feel even harder. There is a kind of pain that comes from loss, and then there is a different kind of pain that comes from silence. Many women discover that the second pain is often harder than the first, because loss at least gives you something visible to grieve. Silence gives you questions. Questions that seem to echo through your mind without receiving an answer. You pray, you wait, you ask God for direction, you ask Him for comfort, you ask Him for clarity, you ask Him to show you what He is doing. And yet day after day, week after week, sometimes even year after year, the heavens can seem quiet, not empty, not abandoned, just quiet. And that quietness can become one of the greatest tests of faith, because most people feel confident trusting God when they can see movement, when doors are opening, when prayers are being answered, when circumstances are improving, when signs are visible. But what happens when none of those things appear? What happens when you continue praying and nothing changes? What happens when you continue believing and no clear answer arrives? What happens when you keep showing up in faith while God seems silent? This is where many women begin fighting an internal battle they never expected. The battle of interpretation. Because when God feels silent, your mind immediately starts trying to explain the silence. And unfortunately, fear is often eager to provide explanations. Maybe God is disappointed in me. Maybe I've made too many mistakes. Maybe I've missed His will. Maybe He is punishing me. Maybe He has moved on. Maybe my prayers are not enough. Maybe my faith is too weak. Maybe He cares about everyone else more than He cares about me. Notice what happens. The silence itself is difficult, but the conclusions we attach to the silence often become even more painful. That is why understanding silence matters. Because if you misunderstand God's silence, you may start believing things that are not true. One of the most dangerous assumptions a believer can make is equating silence with absence. They are not the same thing, not even close. A teacher can be silent during a test without leaving the room. A builder can work beneath a structure without being visible. A gardener can be active beneath the soil long before growth appears above the ground. Activity and visibility are not the same thing, and neither are silence and absence. Yet when emotions are hurting, that distinction becomes difficult to remember. Pain naturally seeks evidence. It wants something tangible, something visible, something immediate. But God often works in ways that cannot be measured by immediate evidence. This reality appears repeatedly throughout Scripture. Again and again, people experienced seasons where God seemed quiet before major transformation occurred. Waiting was not evidence of abandonment. Waiting was part of preparation. The problem is that preparation rarely feels meaningful while you are living through it. It feels frustrating. You want movement. God gives waiting. You want answers. God gives patience. You want clarity. God gives another day of trust. And over Chimi, that process can become exhausting, especially if you have already endured significant loss, because now you are not only grieving what happened, you are also carrying uncertainty about what comes next. That uncertainty creates mental fatigue. You replay conversations, you replay decisions, you replay memories, you replay prayers, you search for explanations, you search for signs, you search for certainty. But certainty remains just out of reach. What many people do not realize is that this season often becomes one of God's greatest classrooms. Not because suffering itself is good, but because waiting reveals things that activity often hides. Waiting reveals where impatience exists. Waiting reveals what controls your peace. Waiting reveals how much your faith depends on visible outcomes. Waiting reveals whether your trust is rooted in God's character or in God's timing. These are difficult lessons, yet they are deeply transformational. Because before this season, perhaps you trusted God primarily when life made sense. Now, you are learning to trust Him when life does not make sense. Before this season, perhaps your confidence depended on seeing progress. Now you are learning to trust even when progress is invisible. Before this season, perhaps peace depended on knowing what would happen next. Now you are learning to rest without possessing all the answers. That kind of growth is not dramatic. It is quiet, slow, hidden, almost invisible at first, which is why many women fail to recognize it. They assume nothing is happening because nothing obvious is changing. Meanwhile, God is doing some of His deepest work beneath the surface. He is reshaping perspectives, strengthening endurance, deepening faith, refining motives, building spiritual maturity, preparing hearts. And most of that work cannot be seen immediately. Think about how roots grow. Before a tree grows upward, it often grows downward. Before visible strength appears, hidden strength develops. The deeper the roots, the greater the stability. The same principle applies spiritually. God often develops depth before visibility. He develops foundations before expansion. He develops character before opportunities. Yet our culture celebrates visible growth, visible success, visible achievements, visible progress. Because of that, hidden seasons can feel like failure. But many of the most important seasons in life are hidden seasons. Seasons when nobody sees the internal transformation taking place. Seasons where God is preparing you in ways you do not yet understand. Seasons where your faith is becoming stronger than your feelings. And perhaps that is one reason some women become remarkably strong after devastating loss. Not because they received immediate answers, not because life suddenly became easy, but because they learned to survive spiritual silence without abandoning trust. That is a profound kind of strength. Anyone can trust when explanations are available. Trust becomes powerful when explanations are absent. Anyone can believe when outcomes are obvious. Faith becomes resilient when outcomes remain unclear. Anyone can feel secure when circumstances are stable. Spiritual maturity develops when stability disappears and trust remains. The world often defines strength as control. Scripture often reveals strength as surrender, and surrender grows in waiting. Surrender grows when you continue praying despite uncertainty. Surrender grows when you continue trusting despite confusion. Surrender grows when you continue moving forward despite unanswered questions. That does not mean the struggle disappears. Far from it. Some days you may still feel frustrated. Some days you may still feel discouraged. Some days you may still wonder why God has not spoken more clearly. Those feelings do not automatically indicate weak faith. They indicate that you are human. Faith is not the absence of questions. Faith is the decision to keep bringing those questions to God. Faith is not pretending everything feels fine. Faith is choosing trust even when everything does not feel fine. And perhaps that is exactly where you are today. Still waiting, still hoping, still praying, still wondering, yet somehow still holding on. What if that persistence is evidence of growth? What if the very fact that you are still seeking God is proof that He is sustaining you? What if the silence has not been empty at all? What if God has been teaching you something that could not be learned any other way? Because there is a strength that develops during silent seasons, a strength that comfort cannot create, a strength that certainty cannot create, a strength that emerges only when trust must exist without visible proof. And that strength may be far greater than you realize. In fact, some of the strongest parts of your faith may have been formed in moments when you felt the weakest, which raises another important question. If waiting is shaping you, what exactly is it producing inside you? Because hidden beneath the pain, hidden beneath the silence, and hidden beneath the uncertainty, something powerful may already be growing. One of the greatest misconceptions about strength is the belief that strong people do not struggle. Many women look at others and assume they possess some special confidence, some unshakable faith, some extraordinary resilience that protects them from fear, doubt, and emotional exhaustion. But that is rarely true. Real strength is not the absence of struggle. Real strength is what develops when struggle refuses to leave. The women who become strongest after losing everything are usually not the women who never cried. They are not the women who never questioned. They are not the women who never felt afraid. They are the women who discovered that faith can survive all those things. Because pain has a unique ability to reveal what comfort often hides. Comfort can make you feel strong. Pain reveals whether you actually are. Comfort can create confidence in circumstances. Pain reveals confidence in God. Comfort can make trust feel easy. Pain reveals whether trust exists when life no longer feels safe. This is why some of the deepest spiritual growth happens during seasons you would never choose. Not because God enjoys your suffering, not because He delights in hardship, but because there are certain truths that only become visible when everything else is stripped away. Think about how gold is refined. The refining process does not create gold. It reveals it. The heat removes impurities that were mixed into it. Similarly, difficult seasons often expose things hidden beneath the surface of the heart. Fear, pride, dependence on approval, dependence on control, dependence on predictable outcomes. The refining process is uncomfortable precisely because it exposes what was already there, and exposure can feel painful. Because sometimes you discovered fears you did not realize were influencing your decisions. You discover insecurities you thought you had overcome. You discover emotional wounds that still affect how you view yourself. You discover areas where your faith is weaker than you imagined. At first, this can feel discouraging. You may think, after everything I've been through, why am I still struggling with these things? But what if the exposure itself is evidence of growth? What if God is revealing these areas because He intends to strengthen them? After all, hidden weaknesses cannot be healed. Unacknowledged fears cannot be surrendered. Ignored wounds cannot be restored. Sometimes the very things causing discomfort are the things God is bringing into the light. And while that process is rarely pleasant, it is often necessary. Because God is not interested in creating the appearance of strength. He develops genuine strength. The kind that remains when emotions fluctuate. The kind that remains when circumstances collapse. The kind that remains when answers are delayed. The kind that remains when life becomes uncertain. And genuine strength develops differently than most people expect. Many people imagine strength as fearlessness. But Scripture consistently reveals something different. Strength is not the absence of fear. Strength is continuing forward despite fear. Fear says, "You will not survive this." Faith says, "God will sustain me." Fear says, "Your future is ruined." Faith says, "God still has a purpose." Fear says, "You are alone." Faith says, "God is present even when I cannot feel Him." Notice something important. Faith does not always eliminate fear immediately. Instead, faith challenges fears, conclusions. That distinction matters. because many women become discouraged when fear continues showing up. They assume fear means they are failing spiritually. But fear itself is not necessarily the problem. The question is whether fear becomes your authority. Fear may speak. Fear may shout. Fear may create worst-case scenarios. Fear may attempt to convince you that disaster is inevitable, but fear does not have to determine your direction. One of the clearest signs of spiritual growth is learning how to recognize fear without surrendering to it. That is not easy, especially after significant loss, because loss gives fear plenty of material to work with. Fear reminds you of what happened. Fear points to past disappointments. Fear warns you against hoping again. Fear encourages you to expect the worst so you cannot be hurt again. And from a human perspective, that approach can seem reasonable. If hope created pain before, why risk hoping again? If trust led to disappointment before, why trust again? If expectations were shattered before, why believe for anything better? These questions often emerge after loss, and they reveal another battle taking place beneath the surface. The battle between protection and healing. Fear promises protection. It tells you that if you stop expecting good things, you cannot be disappointed. If you stop trusting people, you cannot be hurt. If you stop dreaming, you cannot experience failure. But what fear calls protection often becomes imprisonment, because while fear may reduce risk, it also reduces possibility. It shrinks life. It shrinks hope. It shrinks faith. It shrinks purpose. God never designed you to live inside the boundaries fear creates. He designed you to live through faith, not reckless faith, not blind optimism, but confident trust in His character. And that trust grows every time you choose truth over fear. Every time you remind yourself that God's faithfulness is not determined by your circumstances. Every time you refuse to let disappointment define your future. Every time you continue moving forward despite uncertainty. These moments may seem small, but they are powerful, because strength is usually built through small decisions repeated consistently. One decision to pray again. One decision to trust again. One decision to believe again. One decision to surrender again. Over time, those decisions begin creating a foundation that circumstances cannot easily destroy, and something remarkable starts happening. The very season that once seemed determined to break you begins strengthening you, not because the pain disappears, but because your relationship with pain changes. You'll stop viewing every difficulty as evidence that God has abandoned you. You'll stop assuming every delay means something is wrong. You stop measuring God's presence solely through visible outcomes. Instead, you begin recognizing His faithfulness in deeper ways. You begin noticing His provision during difficult moments. You begin noticing His strength carrying you through days you thought you could not survive. You begin noticing peace appearing when circumstances offer no reason for peace. You begin noticing resilience developing where fragility once existed. And often, these changes happen gradually. So gradually that you may not recognize them at first, until one day you look back and realize that the woman who entered this season is not the same woman standing here now. The fears that once controlled you no longer have the same power. The disappointments that once defined you no longer define your identity. The uncertainty that once overwhelmed you no longer determines your peace. You are not stronger because life became easier. You are stronger because God met you in difficulty. You are stronger because He taught you to trust Him beyond your feelings. You are stronger because He remained faithful while teaching you how to depend on Him. And perhaps this leads to one of the most surprising revelations of all. Many women enter seasons of loss believing the greatest danger is losing something important. But often the greater danger is losing sight of who they are. Because when enough things are taken away, identity itself can begin to feel uncertain. And that brings us to another critical part of the journey. If you are no longer defined by what you've lost, then who are you? Because the answer to that question may change everything. One of the most painful consequences of loss is that it rarely takes only one thing. It often takes pieces of identity with it. That is why some losses hurt far more deeply than others. Because what disappeared was never just a relationship, never just a career, never just a dream, never just a season. What disappeared had become connected to how you saw yourself. And when that connection breaks, an uncomfortable question often emerges. Who am I now? For many women, this question becomes one of the most difficult parts of the journey. Not because they lack value, not because God has forgotten who they are, but because they spent years building part of their identity around something that no longer exists. Perhaps you identified yourself through being someone's partner, perhaps through being needed, perhaps through success, perhaps through stability, perhaps through a future you expected to live. Then suddenly the thing that helped define you was removed, and now you are left standing in unfamiliar territory. You know who you used to be, but you are not entirely sure who you are becoming. This identity struggle often remains hidden. People talk about grief, people talk about disappointment, people talk about heartbreak, but fewer people talk about the confusion that comes when loss changes the way you see yourself, because identity influences everything. It influences your confidence, your decisions, your expectations, your relationships, your ability to move forward. When identity becomes unstable, life can begin feeling unstable as well. That is why many women spend years trying to recover what they lost, not necessarily because they want the thing itself, but because they want the version of themselves that existed before it disappeared. They want to feel familiar again. They want to feel secure again. They want to feel certain again. They want to feel like themselves again. But what if God is not trying to restore the old version of you? What if He is creating something deeper? This is where transformation becomes both beautiful and difficult, because God often rebuilds identity differently than we expect. We tend to define ourselves through external realities. God defines us through eternal realities. We look at what we do. God looks at who we are. We look at accomplishments. God looks at character. We look at status. God looks at identity. The challenge is that external things are constantly changing. Relationships change. Careers change. Health changes. Opportunities change. Seasons change. But God's view of you remains constant, and that consistency becomes incredibly important during seasons of loss. Because when everything else feels uncertain, identity must be anchored somewhere stable. Otherwise, every circumstance becomes capable of redefining you. Many women unknowingly spend years seeking identity through achievement. If they succeed, they feel valuable. If they fail, they feel inadequate. Others seek identity through relationships. If they feel loved, they feel secure. If they experience rejection, they feel worthless. Others seek identity through control. If life goes according to plan, they feel confident. If life becomes uncertain, they feel overwhelmed. The problem is not the achievement, the relationship, or the plan. The problem is asking temporary things to answer eternal questions. Questions like, who am I? Am I enough? Do I matter? Do I have value? Do I have purpose? Temporary things cannot permanently answer those questions. Only God can. And often loss exposes this reality, because when the temporary things disappear, the deeper questions remain. At first, this can feel frightening, but it can also become one of the greatest opportunities for spiritual growth. Because for the first time, you begin separating your identity from your circumstances. You begin understanding that your value was never created by your success. Your worth was never created by another person's approval. Your significance was never created by a particular role. Your purpose was never created by a specific season. Those things may have influenced your experience, but they never created your identity. God did. This truth sounds simple, yet living it requires transformation, because emotionally, many women continue carrying labels that God never assigned to them. Failure, rejected, forgotten, damaged, unwanted, disqualified. Behind these labels are stories, painful stories, stories shaped by disappointment, betrayal, abandonment, mistakes, and heartbreak. Over time, those experiences can become lenses through which you view yourself, and eventually you stop saying, I experienced loss. Instead, you begin believing, I am a lost person. You stop saying, I experienced rejection. Instead, you begin believing, I am unworthy. You stop saying, I experienced failure. Instead, You begin believing, I am a failure. That shift is dangerous because experiences are temporary. Identity becomes personal. The enemy of your soul understands this. That is why one of his greatest strategies is convincing you that what happened to you defines who you are. Because if he can control your identity, he can influence your future. But God's truth tells a different story. Your losses are real. Your wounds are real. Your disappointments are real. Yet none of them possess the authority to define you. God alone holds that authority. And his perspective is far different from the conclusions pain often creates. God sees value where you see weakness, purpose where you see failure, potential where you see limitation, hope where you see uncertainty, future where you see endings. This does not mean ignoring reality. It means refusing to allow painful experiences to become your identity. There is a profound difference. Because healing begins when you separate who you are from what happened to you. You are not your heartbreak. You are not your disappointment. You are not your divorce. You are not your mistake. You are not your failure. You are not your loss. Those things may be chapters in your story, but they are not the title of your story. And perhaps this is one reason some women become stronger after losing everything. Loss forces them to discover who they are without the things they once depended on. At first, that feels terrifying, but eventually it becomes freeing. Because when your identity rests in God rather than circumstances, circumstances lose the power to define your worth. You begin walking differently, not because every problem has disappeared, but because your foundation has changed. You stop chasing validation from people. You stop measuring your value through outcomes. You stop believing that your future depends on recreating your past. Instead, you begin understanding that God's plans for your life were never limited to what you lost. And that realization creates space for something new. Hope, not superficial optimism, not denial, but genuine hope rooted in God's faithfulness. Because once identity becomes secure, another question naturally emerges. If your value remains intact, if your purpose has not been destroyed, if your losses do not define your future, then what if this painful season is preparing you for something you cannot yet see? What if the ending you have been grieving is not the end of the story at all? What if purpose is beginning to emerge from the very place where everything seemed broken? There comes a moment in many seasons of loss when a subtle shift begins to happen. At first, you do not notice it. You are still grieving, still healing, still carrying unanswered questions, still learning how to trust again. But somewhere beneath the surface, something begins changing. You stop asking only, why did this happen? And you begin asking, what might God be doing through this? That question marks an important turning point. Not because all the pain suddenly disappears, not because every answer becomes clear, but because your focus begins moving from destruction toward possibility. And that shift changes everything. One of the enemy's greatest goals during seasons of loss is convincing you that your story has ended. He wants you to believe that what happened has permanently disqualified you, that the failure is final, that the disappointment is permanent, that the dream is dead, that your best years are behind you, that your usefulness has been diminished, that God can no longer do anything meaningful with your life. These thoughts often sound convincing because they are fueled by visible evidence. After all, something was lost, something did end, something did change. Those realities are true, but they are not the complete truth. Because throughout Scripture, God repeatedly demonstrates His ability to bring purpose out of places that appear broken. Again and again, what looked like an ending became preparation. What looked like defeat became development. What looked like loss became redirection. What looked like silence became formation. This pattern appears so often that it becomes impossible to ignore. God specializes in working with situations that appear beyond repair, not because He enjoys pain, but because He understands something we often forget. An ending and a conclusion are not always the same thing. Many women assume that because one chapter ended, the entire story has been decided. But God often writes new chapters where people expected final conclusions. The difficulty is that purpose usually becomes visible only after a period of waiting. Rarely in the middle of the storm, rarely during the deepest grief, rarely during the most confusing moments. Instead, purpose often emerges gradually, one lesson at a time, one realization at a time, one step at a time. At first, you may only notice small changes. You respond differently to challenges. You handle uncertainty with greater peace. You recover from disappointment more quickly. You recognize fear sooner. You trust God more deeply. These changes may seem insignificant, but they are evidence of transformation. Because purpose is not only about what you will do, purpose is also about who you are becoming. Many people think purpose begins when God opens a new door. Often purpose begins long before that. It begins while God is shaping your character, strengthening your faith, expanding your compassion, deepening your wisdom, developing your endurance, preparing your heart. And perhaps one of the most beautiful outcomes of suffering is the compassion it creates. Women who have walked through deep loss often develop a unique ability to understand the pain of others. Not theoretically, personally. They know what heartbreak feels like. They know what uncertainty feels like. They know what disappointment feels like. They know what it means to pray through tears. They know what it means to continue trusting when life makes no sense. And because of that, they often become sources of encouragement that comfort alone could never have produced. The very wounds they wish they never experienced become places from which they can help others heal. That does not mean the suffering was good. It means God is capable of bringing good from suffering. There is an important difference. God never wastes pain. Humans waste pain. We become bitter. We close our hearts. We isolate ourselves. We refuse to grow. We allow wounds to define us. But when pain is surrendered to God, He has a remarkable ability to transform it into something meaningful. Sometimes that meaning appears through wisdom. Sometimes through ministry. Sometimes through relationships. Sometimes through influence. Sometimes through opportunities that would never have existed otherwise. And often, the very experience you wanted removed becomes part of the testimony God uses most powerfully. Think about how many women spend years praying for greater purpose, greater impact, greater spiritual growth, greater intimacy with God. Yet when the process begins, it rarely arrives in the form they expected, because purpose is often developed through preparation, and preparation rarely feels exciting while it is happening. It feels slow, uncomfortable, stretching, sometimes painful, but preparation creates capacity, and capacity is necessary for future assignments. Imagine receiving a responsibility before developing the character required to carry it. The blessing could become a burden. The opportunity could become overwhelming. The assignment could become destructive. God understands this, which is why He often prepares people before promoting them. He develops depth before influence. He develops maturity before expansion. He develops faith before greater responsibility. Looking back, many women eventually realized that the season they tried hardest to escape was actually preparing them for the season they later thanked God for. Not because the pain was enjoyable, but because the growth was invaluable. And perhaps that is true for you as well. Perhaps this season has been accomplishing more than you realized. Perhaps God has been building strength where weakness once existed. Perhaps He has been building wisdom where confusion once existed. Perhaps He has been building trust where fear once existed. Perhaps He has been preparing you for assignments that require a version of you that did not yet exist before this loss. That possibility changes how you view your past. Instead of seeing only devastation, you begin seeing development. Instead of seeing only endings, you begin seeing preparation. Instead of seeing only what was taken away, you begin seeing what was created through the process. And slowly, hope begins returning. Not because every question has been answered, but because you begin trusting the author of the story. You begin believing that God's plans are larger than your disappointments. You begin believing that His purpose is stronger than your setbacks. You begin believing that your future is not determined by your losses. You begin believing that God is still writing. And perhaps that is the most important realization of all. Because once you understand that God has been shaping you all along, everything begins looking different. The silence looks different. The waiting looks different. The loss looks different. The pain looks different, not smaller, not easier, but meaningful. And that realization prepares you for the final truth. The truth that answers the question we have been exploring from the beginning. Why do some women become stronger after losing everything? The answer is not found merely in what they lost. It is found in what remained when everything else was gone. At the beginning of this journey, we asked a difficult question. Why do some women become stronger after losing everything? Not harder, not colder, not more guarded, but genuinely stronger. The answer is not as simple as surviving pain. Many people survive pain. Many people endure loss. Many people walk through disappointment. The difference lies in what happens within them during the process. Because strength is not created merely by suffering. Strength is created when suffering drives you closer to God instead of farther away from Him. And that is where the deepest transformation occurs. When everything else begins disappearing, something becomes painfully clear. The things you once depended on were never meant to carry the weight of your soul. The relationship could not. The career could not. The dream could not. The plan could not. The approval of others could not. The certainty you wanted could not. Only God could. And sometimes it takes losing lesser foundations before we discover the strength of the Eternal One. That realization changes everything. Because eventually you begin to see that the greatest miracle was not necessarily getting everything back. The greatest miracle was discovering that God remained when everything else was gone. He remained when the answers disappeared. He remained when the plans collapsed. He remained when the future became uncertain. He remained when people left. He remained when opportunities closed. He remained when your heart was broken. He remained when your faith felt fragile. He remained. And perhaps that is what you were really learning all along. Not simply how to recover from loss, but how to build your life on something that loss cannot take away. That is a different kind of confidence, a different kind of peace, a different kind of strength. Because when your confidence depends on circumstances, peace disappears whenever circumstances change. But when your confidence rests in God, circumstances lose the power to control your entire emotional world. This does not mean you stop feeling pain. It does not mean you stop grieving. It does not mean you become unaffected by disappointment. It simply means that disappointment no longer becomes your master. Fear no longer becomes your authority. Loss no longer becomes your identity because something deeper has taken root. Trust. Not the shallow trust that exists only when life goes according to plan, but the mature trust that remains even when life does not. The trust that says, I do not understand everything, but I know God is faithful. I do not have every answer, but I know God is good. I cannot see the entire future, but I know God is already there. That kind of trust changes the way you walk through life. You stop needing certainty before taking the next step. You stop demanding explanations before obeying God. You stop believing that every closed door is a sign of failure. You stop measuring God's presence by visible results alone. Instead, you begin recognizing His faithfulness everywhere. In the strength He gave you to survive, in the peace He provided during anxious nights, in the wisdom He developed through difficult seasons, in the growth that occurred while you thought nothing was happening, in the resilience that quietly formed beneath the surface. And when you look back, you begin noticing something remarkable. The woman standing here now is not the same woman who entered the season of loss. She sees differently, trusts differently, prays differently, believes differently. Not because life became easier, but because God became more real. The things that once controlled her no longer have the same power. The fears that once dominated her thoughts no longer determine her future. The disappointments that once seemed unbearable no longer defined her identity. She has learned something that can only be learned through experience. God's faithfulness is not dependent on favorable circumstances. His faithfulness is part of His nature. And once that truth settles deeply into your heart, fear begins losing its grip. Because fear thrives on uncertainty, but faith thrives on God's character. Fear asks, what if everything goes wrong? Faith answers, God will still be faithful. Fear asks, what if I lose something again? Faith answers, God will still be faithful. Fear asks, what if the future looks different than I expected? Faith answers, God will still be faithful. Eventually, you realize that your confidence was never supposed to rest in outcomes. It was supposed to rest in the one who remains constant through every outcome. That realization creates freedom. Freedom to trust again. Freedom to hope again. Freedom to dream again. Freedom to move forward again. Not because you are guaranteed a life without hardship, but because you know hardship is not stronger than God. And perhaps that is the ultimate lesson hidden inside seasons of loss. The strongest women are not always the women who avoided heartbreak. They are often the women who discovered God's faithfulness in the middle of heartbreak. The strongest women are not always the women who received immediate answers. They are often the women who learned to trust while waiting. The strongest women are not always the women whose lives unfolded perfectly. They are often the women whose lives were interrupted, redirected, broken, rebuilt, and transformed by God's hands. Because true strength is not found in never falling apart. True strength is found in discovering that God can hold you together when everything else falls apart. So, if you are in a season of loss today, remember this: your story is not finished. Your purpose is not gone. Your identity is not destroyed. Your future is not disqualified. And God's plans for your life have not ended. What feels like an ending may be preparation. What feels like silence may be formation. What feels like weakness may be the beginning of strength. And what feels like the loss of everything may actually become the place where you discover the one thing that can never be taken away: the presence of God, the faithfulness of God, the love of God, the purpose of God, the truth of God. Those realities remain when everything else changes. And when they become your foundation, you become stronger than circumstances could ever make you. If this message encouraged you, take a moment to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more biblical wisdom for everyday life. And as you leave today, remember this simple truth: sometimes the women who become strongest are not those who avoided loss, but those who discovered that after everything else was gone, God was still there.